Hey, look, it's just a little oil and water vapor, that's it.
Well, so that's actually the biggest lie about e-cigarettes, is that it's water vapor. That's an oil and petroleum solution.
When you think about the so-called continuum of risk, you know, you've got pure air over here, healthiest thing on the planet, and you've got cigarettes over here, one of the most deadly things ever invented. Where is an e-cigarette on that scale?
I think it's just about as close to cigarettes as you can possibly get.
And the CDC is now advising people worried about health risks to avoid vaping. But at the same time, they say anyone using e-cigarettes to quit smoking should not go back to cigarettes.
Most of us know that smoking is bad for our health. In fact, it's the biggest preventable cause of death in the country. Over 3 million people currently use e-cigarettes. However, there are still lots of misconceptions around their relative safety. I'm here with one of the country's leading stop smoking experts who's going to carry out an experiment to show the impact of smoking conventional cigarettes compared to e-cigarettes.
And what we are going to do is we are going to have one bell jar set up to smoke the average number of cigarettes smoked by a smoker each month. And then we have another bell jar through which we draw vapor from an e-cigarette for the same amount of time. And then, as a control condition, we have clear air to demonstrate not smoking or vaping. So let's see what's going to happen. Here is the bell jar with cigarette smoke.
I mean, it just is so revolting. Look at this, that's just the inside of the jar. Here, a lump of tar. So that's what's going on inside your lungs. And now we're going to cut this tube. And look at that. There's loads of it. And this is only after 1 month. So is this what's happening inside our bodies when we smoke?
It's certainly a good indication. So now let's have a look at the e-cigarette.
Let's just see. A little bit of vapour. That's the only one that's really got much in the way of colour. Just feels wet.
My research shows that e-cigarettes are significantly less harmful than cigarettes. A big reason for this is the tar, which you can see here, which is not produced by e-cigarettes, but produced by cigarettes. The impact of using e-cigarettes in the long term is very similar to using licensed nicotine products such as nicotine patches or nicotine gum, as you can see here when you compare the control jar with the vapor jar.
So this experiment shows that every cigarette you smoke causes tar to enter your body, and it's the tar that contains the poisonous chemicals that spread through the bloodstream,
which are linked to diseases such as heart disease, stroke, and cancer.
If you are thinking of quitting, search Smoke Free and find the best way for you to quit with a free personal quit plan.
There's an epidemic spreading. Scientists say it can change your brain. It can release dangerous chemicals like formaldehyde into your bloodstream. It can expose your lungs to acrolein, which can cause irreversible damage. It's not a parasite, not a virus, not an infection. It's vaping.
So we'll start with what are they? I'll give a little bit of background. So the good news, folks, is that smoking rates are down. Cigarette smoking rates are the lowest that we've ever seen since we started assessing them. They've been coming down among adults since the mid-60s. Of course, the first Surgeon General was reported in 1964, was the impetus for that. And the most recent stats for 2017 were down to 14%. 14%, which is absolutely remarkable. The lowest we've ever recorded. The federal benchmark for 2020 was 12%. And I would have told you that it would have been a cold day in hell and Satan would have been giving sleigh rides if we were actually going to meet that about 5 years ago. But now we actually made it. And we're very close, within 2 percentage points of hitting that target, which is simply unprecedented. Among youth, same, we're still going down. We are now well below 10% among kids, again, the lowest that we've ever seen. And that has been since the mid-90s. And so the reason we started seeing declines was in 1998, the Master Settlement Agreement between 46 states' attorney general and the tobacco industry, where they acknowledged the risks of tobacco use and have agreed to pay money in perpetuity to the states for the harms of tobacco.
All right, thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Boughner, and I currently serve as the Vice President of the American Vapor Manufacturers Association, a trade group that was launched in 2020 to assist small businesses, manufacturers in navigating the complex FDA pre-market review process. Our guests will be joining us shortly for approximately 40 minutes of dialogue, followed by 15 to 20 minutes of questions from the audience. Co-hosting with me today is Gregory Conley, the Director of Legislative Affairs for the AVM.
Thank you, Allison. Our goal for today's conversation is to be productive. So Alice and I are going to try our best to avoid getting tangled up in debates that won't be settled in the midst of an hour-long discussion. Having said that, let's not waste any time. Joining us today is Dr. Brian King, the former Deputy Director for Research Translation in the CDC's Office on Smoking and Health, and since July of last year, the Director of the FDA Center for Tobacco Products. Dr. King, thanks for joining us today.
Great. Thanks for having me, Greg. And Allison, good to be with you today.
Nice to see you. I would just like to start off with some things we appear to agree on. Let me just tick off a few of those quickly, and we'll see if that's true. You've said that as a general product class, vaping products are far less hazardous than smoking cigarettes. Is that something that you think every adult American should know?
Yeah, I would agree with this statement that if an adult smoker were to transition completely from a cigarette to an e-cigarette, that would be a benefit to their health. Yes.
The science on that now is widely understood, so I'm sure you would agree it seems obviously unethical for anyone to mislead the public into believing that nicotine vaping might be just or more dangerous than vaping, right?
Yeah, I would say that there's definitely a lot of nuances around the product class. And so although we know that in general, e-cigarettes have lower risk than a conventional cigarette, there's a broad class and there's a lot of different factors that can influence the extent of risk. And so it's not just a simple statement that every single e-cigarette is going to be lower risk. There's different factors that we have to consider, particularly when it comes to risk to vulnerable populations like kids.
And just to be clear, has FDA ever identified a single nicotine vaping product, not a illicit THC cartridge, that could be more hazardous than smoking?
I would say that at present, we evaluate the merits of evidence that has been submitted to this agency in terms of applications and science on their products. At present, we have authorized 23 e-cigarette products or devices that we have found the net benefits outweigh the risks. And we'll continue to do that. The onus is on the applicants to submit that information, and we're fully open to evaluating that information and making an informed scientific decision.
Do you acknowledge that U.S. studies, some funded by your own agency, show that millions of people who formerly smoked now vape in America?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have science from surveillance, both among adult smokers as well as other populations, including youth, unfortunately, that are using these products. We've definitely seen a decline among kids in recent years, and that's a really good thing. We want that to continue. I think we still got more work to go there. And I will say that there's also a growing body of literature that has shown that people are using e-cigarettes to quit smoking completely. And again, that's a good thing too. We don't want people using combustible cigarettes. It's 7,000 chemicals and 70 carcinogens. But again, it's that nuance of we need to have the robust science, and it's growing, but we still need more clarity on the innovations and what products and what aspects of those products are the ones that are going to most efficiently deliver that nicotine to a smoker so that they can transition completely and quit for good. And ultimately, we've got a lot of growing science. That's a good thing, but we need more.
Quitting smoking is extremely difficult, and I know that firsthand. And most people using FDA-approved NRTs fail at that. Can we agree that more options and a variety of solutions that are available, the more people will successfully quit?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely. I think innovation is a good thing. And I think the innovation is on both ends. And so, of course, we have to make sure that we're continuing to grow, we're continuing to evolve. We follow the science to make that informed decision making. But it's also mindful to remember that we have parameters in this country in terms of how we regulate those products. And so if it's tobacco products and you want that authorization, it's got to go through that pathway. If you want to promote your product as a cessation device, we have that pathway as well. And ultimately, it just comes down to that evidence and making sure that that's delivered to the agency. And so for my part, over Center for Tobacco Products, we're committed to evaluating the evidence that comes in and makes those determinations. That's what we'll continue to do. That's what we've done. We've authorized e-cigarettes in the past. I can't speak for my colleagues in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, but if an entity wants to submit an application for a cessation product that's an e-cigarette, they can certainly do so, and we would evaluate that application on the merits.
Thank you. With the preliminaries out of the way, one topic we received many questions about is misinformation. So, of course, FDA Commissioner Dr. Robert Califf has made combating misinformation one of his top priorities. And as you have acknowledged, the American public's understanding of nicotine is not in line with the science. Approximately 80% of Americans, including a majority of adults who smoke combustible cigarettes, believe vaping could be just as hazardous or worse than smoking. As well, Rutgers University researchers funded by CTP have documented how healthcare providers suffer from that erroneous misperception as well. Additionally, I'm sure you're aware that the research from the PATH data and other studies show that when a smoker or ex-smoker understands that vaping is less hazardous, they're more likely to stick with it. And so you have been on the job for 7 months. We can't blame you for anything that's happened before those 7 months. But in that 7 months, what have you done to combat misinformation among the general public and medical professionals?
So I would like to acknowledge that I'm fully cognizant of the misperceptions. And as I've noted before, I'm a scientist. I follow the data, and there's definitely studies that demonstrating that there's misperceptions. And also when it comes to interventions to address that, you also have to look to the science. And so for our part, I am wholly open to enhanced efforts by the Center for Tobacco Products to message not only on the continuum of risk, but also misperceptions related to nicotine. But again, the devil is going to be in the details there in terms of making sure that we have scientifically defensible messages and that we're delivering it to the target population, which is adult smokers, and not inadvertently delivering it to the unintended populations where there's consequences, including youth. And so in terms of the work we're doing, we have initiated formative work in terms of qualitative studies to assess adult perceptions around nicotine. And ultimately, we hope to use that to inform public messaging. But again, the data is going to drive it. And so any campaign or any broad scale work has to be informed by this formative work. And so we have initiated that, and I hope to continue it. Our Office of Health Communications is on top of building that formative work, and we hope to continue that moving forward and help inform potential strategies. I do think there's more opportunity here, and I think that we can be more transparent. We've said that in the release today around the Reagan Udall evaluation, that there's definitely opportunities here, including through enhanced engagement with stakeholders, but also our public communications, including on our website, to make that more clear. If there's anything that folks know about me, it's I aim to be the most non-bureaucratic bureaucrat that you've ever met, and that involves just straight shooting. And so if we can do better, I want to know about it, and we can definitely enhance the communication on that front. So I would say more to come, but the science is going to drive it, and we're at the initial stages in informing what effective messages are most critical to reach the target audience without unintended consequences.
Glad to hear, and you're bringing up how the formative scientific research has begun, but for at least 5-6 years, the former director of CTP and other CTP employees have spoken at conferences and repeatedly said that correcting misperceptions around nicotine is something CTP wants to do. So are you saying that before you entered the job, zero progress had been made on figuring out how to message the truth to adult smokers and the medical community?
No, I wouldn't say zero, but I will say that we have a lot of competing priorities in this center. As has been evidenced by my first 7 months, a lot has happened. And when you have a finite number of resources and people, you have to prioritize what you do to have the greatest impact. And so I will say that for my part, And coming into this position, there's 4 key tenets that I am adhering to, and that's strong science, stakeholder relations, communications, and health equity. And so obviously the stakeholder relations and communications are pivotal to this. And so in terms of my prioritization, I think it's important that we engage with people, hear them out, but also use the science to inform our communication strategies moving forward. So it's not a knock that we haven't done this work before, but it's where prioritization is moving forward. And I can tell you that we're working on it. But again, the science is going to drive it. And just because you do a study doesn't mean that it's going to give you the answer that you want, or that it's going to provide the necessary information. And, that's how science works. And you continue to do more robust research until you get a solid evidence base that will help inform a strategy for comms. And that's what we've done for our public health education campaigns among kids. And now we're beginning formative work as well for adults.
Sure.
Leading journals have examined the impact of FDA's advertising, in which vaping is portrayed as being possessed by demons, shape-shifting metal dragons, something that you fish out of the toilet, or products that'll cause huge parasites to crawl through your skin. I personally talk to adult customers every single day who see these messages and are terrified. Can you see how the FDA itself has become the main contributor to misinforming and scaring adults in a way that keeps them smoking?
I'll say that we do rigorous evaluation, both before and after the implementation of any of our campaigns. And all of the youth-centric ones have very targeted strategies to reach that target population. And we cognitively test them and do science in the beginning, and then we evaluate them on the back end. And that science has shown demonstrably that there is a beneficial impact. That said, I think that we've got opportunity for better public engagement on our campaigns. We do solicit input, and we've done that in the past. But as we noted earlier today with the Reagan Udall evaluation release, we are looking to expand efforts to make sure we get feedback, including from the public, and that's for the full continuum. It's before the campaigns start to get feedback, and then also on the back end in terms of science around evaluation. But we're also proceeding forward with formative work to more objectively look at what are the best avenues to get feedback from people. And I think that we frequently do, listening sessions, and that's good. We have public engagement, but ultimately it's helpful to identify what are going to be the most effective ways to get that information from people. That is a critical component of our work. We don't function in silos, and we want the opportunity to engage, but we've got to give people that opportunity. And if they've got data, if they've got evidence to demonstrate that a certain message or a certain target audience is going to be problematic in terms of the campaign, we welcome it, but we've got to have the data and they've got to submit it. And so for our part, we're ramping up efforts to make sure that we do get that information and we do hear from people.
So just in December, I'm sure you have your subscription still to the Journal of Nicotine and Tobacco Research, the December edition, that featured a study where about 160 or 116 adult smokers, daily smokers, are randomized to either view FDA epidemic ads or view no ad. Those adult daily smokers who viewed the epidemic ads rated e-cigarettes as more harmful, less effective for quitting, and reported lower switching motivation. Does that study concern you?
I will say that it does, but we've got to look at the preponderance of the evidence and also the rigorous nature of the science. And so when we do make scientific decisions, we've got to look at all the studies that have been conducted, and then we have to look at the rigor and the limitations of specific studies. And so we can't cherry pick individual studies to meet a preconceived notion. We've got to look at the full bolus, and that's what we use when we make our decisions around the communication strategies we do, the decisions that we make around regulation. And so we definitely want studies that are showing the true accurate impact on different populations. And then we use that to inform our strategy. Similar to what we do with the application reviews around weighing the net benefits and the risks. The same as we got to look at the available science and then make an informed decision based on the impact of those estimates, the noted limitations around those studies, and what that net benefit risk is. And right now there's a preponderance of evidence demonstrating the effectiveness of these campaigns among kids. And we continue to refine our target strategies to make sure we're reaching that key population, which is youth and young adults.
And speaking of your targeting strategies, the words micro-targeted and hyper-targeted have both been used by Kathleen Crosby as well as former CTP director Mitch Zeller to describe how you're putting those ads out there, but you don't want to reach adults because, as Mitch and Kathleen have noted, you don't want to scare adults away from trying these products. So will you commit to studying and releasing demographic data on who is actually receiving these ads? Because again, as Alli said, we're getting tons of comments from people who are watching adult-oriented programming on Hulu that are getting just nonstop epidemic ads that on shows that don't seem to have a great deal of children in the audience.
What I'm committing to is continued engagement with folks and more opportunity to provide that information. And so I would encourage anyone who has information or science on any of this information. We've got mechanisms to get that information to us. I can't speak for the director of my Office of Health Communications in terms of the nuances of that work. As you can imagine, I've got a lot of different aspects of our portfolio. So the more detailed questions are best left to the subject matter expert. But for my part, I definitely think we have more opportunities for engagement. And I would recommend that anyone who has information or data that they think we should know about, submit it to the agency. And there's a variety of mechanisms to do so. And when it comes to campaigns, as I noted, we'll have more opportunities moving forward in terms of public comment to make sure that people are able to provide that information to us. It's wholly welcomed.
Sure. We will follow up with Kathleen Crosby at the Health Education Office. Allison?
Yep. So a little bit about, the illicit market here. Any Econ 101 student could tell you about how sweeping government bans create black markets and a laundry list of public health harms, just like what happened with alcohol prohibition and marijuana. By outlawing 99.99% of the products applied to at the FDA, you've sparked a huge emerging black market. Surely you realize that this is far worse than a world where 18 million adult vapers can purchase legal products?
What's the question?
I mean, is it better?
Do you agree?
Is it better? You have 12 to 18 million American adults who vape. Is it better that they're able to purchase the products they want in a legal market or by purchasing them from illicit sources?
So I think this depends on what you define as an illicit source. And so in terms of the work that the Center for Tobacco Products does, any product on the market that does not have an authorization is considered illegal. And so in terms of our enforcement and compliance strategies, we're committed to taking action to address those that are violative. And that can take a broad spectrum of actions, whether it be warning letters all the way up to the recent actions we've taken around civil money penalties, as well as injunctions. But we have an obligation to enforce the law. And that's what we will do. That is what Congress has told us to do. And so we're committed to continuing to do that. But in addition, we're also working to make sure we get efficiencies and ramp up our efforts around reviewing applications. I know this is something that folks are very interested in. We definitely have a sizable bolus of applications we continue to work through, but we're committed to making sure that we review those as quickly as possible so that companies do have that opportunity to be authorized so that they are not subject to enforcement and compliance.
But it is better if people get their products legally. That's what CTP's view would be. It is better if we're going to have a market that people are using legal products.
Yes, one would hope that people would obey the law. Yes, CTP is on the side of the law.
And so if
sorry, go ahead, Greg.
If a majority of American adults who vape want and desire flavored vaping products and face no criminal penalty for purchase or possession, what gives you faith in CTP's ability to override their preferences with the relatively low market share products that have passed through the PMTA process?
I'll say that we continue to evaluate the evidence of what has been submitted to us, and the onus is on firms to give us the best available evidence to make sure that they have a successful application in terms of an authorization. And so we're committed to continuing to work with firms to make sure that they are aware of the guidance and that they submit robust applications. But ultimately, this is something that I think we've got an opportunity for improvement, but the onus remains on the firms to submit that science. And we are required by Congress to follow a certain pathway and protocol to review those. And we'll continue to do those in addition to utilizing our enforcement compliance authorities.
Sure. And during an interview with the Truth Initiative last year, you sort of downplayed, and you can say whether or not you think that's a fair characterization, any concerns about, quote, strong illicit trade developing because of CTP's actions. Yet today, there is currently what's approaching a multi-billion-dollar market for products that the agency considers illegal and not subject to enforcement discretion. How do you square that lack of concern for strong illicit trade with what we see in the market today?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand the distinction between what we're calling illicit trade. But in terms of the References and Truth Initiative, what I was speaking to was the profound body of scientific evidence that has demonstrated over time the diminished impact of illicit trade through the implementation of population-based tobacco control policies. We've seen that with taxation in the past. We're seeing this more recently with menthol prohibitions for cigarettes in multiple international locations, including in Canada and in the Netherlands. And so that was the context for the statement that was made.
Sure, but do you have concern that this multi-billion-dollar illicit market may continue?
I continue to have concerns that there are illegal products on the marketplace. And so for our part at CTP, we're committed to continuing to review applications as quickly as possible to make sure there is a clear pathway for folks to get authorized. And for those who don't, I'm also equally committed to making sure that we enforce the law.
Are you at all concerned that the current strategy at FDA that seems to involve outlawing nearly all vaping products could backfire both in terms of public health and perception of CTP as a regulator?
I will say that I'm committed to continue to implement the law. This is what Congress has told us to do. We have specific authorities that we are responsible for. And as my job as the director of that center, I have to make sure that we exercise those authorities. And towards that end, I don't think we're perfect. I think we've got opportunity for improvement. That was duly noted in the recommendations that came from the Reagan Udall evaluation, but also in our response earlier today. And I think that there's always opportunity for improvement. We acknowledge that. I think we can do some things better. And from our part, I'm happy to continue to move us into the next chapter of the center to make sure that we're engaging people in a meaningful way. And the bottom line for me is we want to achieve our mission, which is reduce tobacco-related disease and death. And that's what I'm committed to using the parameters afforded to us by Congress.
So you recently wrote that CTP wants to bring health equity to the forefront of tobacco product regulation. And one of our members is a vape shop owner in East Harlem. Her customers are almost all low income, and it's the most racially diverse community in the country. She helped hundreds of adults quit smoking cigarettes and switch to vaping. And her business had to declare bankruptcy last year because of the state and federal vaping bans. She watched most of her customers go back to smoking combustible cigarettes. That's an economic and public health disaster. I mean, how do you, say that that's, those regulations somehow advance the cause of health equity?
I'll say that, it's certainly unfortunate when we hear of businesses closing, and that's certainly not something that we want to hear. But ultimately, it's our responsibility to enforce the law, and that's what this center will do. When we continue to look at the collective impact of the actions, and there's a lot of factors that can influence specific businesses, but we're not working against small businesses or large businesses. We're enforcing the law, and we'll continue to do that. But for our part, I do think there's opportunities that we can more productively engage and be transparent and also mindful of ensuring that manufacturers and retailers have the information they need to abide by the law.
So CTP has been describing teen vaping as an epidemic since 2018, a word that was chosen using focus groups to heighten the emotional reaction. But since then, teen vaping has plummeted, and today fewer than 3% of teens vape daily. That's not what the word epidemic means, not clinically, not scientifically, and not in common sense. So how do you expect to be taken seriously by the public as a scientific agency when you continue to use a flatly erroneous term like that?
Yeah, so I believe you're speaking about the CDC, and FDA has not used that terminology to use the most recent estimates of youth use. I will say that I'm an epidemiologist by training, so I'm fully cognizant of the definition of an epidemic, which is unprecedented increases over what you'd expected baseline. That said, I think and know that the science has shown a decline in the number of youth users, and that's a good thing. Over the past couple years, we have seen declines since the peak in 2019. It's still too high. We've got 2.5 million kids that are still using these products. And based on what we're seeing with other products among kids, including cigarettes and smokeless and others, we we can achieve those low levels as well, below 2%, 1 per 2%. I do disagree with the notion that we should only be concerned with daily use among kids. We do have research that demonstrate even infrequent use elicit signs and symptoms of dependency. And so from my perspective, any youth use of these products is problematic, and that, that's how you become a frequent user is there's a pathway from intermediary to frequent use. But regardless, the good news is that it's coming down. I hope that continues. We certainly have the pandemic effect, which has affected everything, right? We see it on a variety of health indicators. So it's interesting to see next year, once kids are now back in school more frequently, and there's potential social sources, whether we see a change in that use. But I hope it continues to decline. And as I've noted, previously, I see where we can go based on the use of other products, and I'm hopeful that we can continue these types of interventions to continue to reduce use. But it's not mutually exclusive from actions to help continue to address the issue of harm reduction among adult smokers and getting them to quit completely.
So on your watch, sorry, Allison. So on your watch, the FDA has decided to no longer use the term epidemic.
Since I've started, I haven't uttered it. I'm not aware of any of my staff, but as far as I'm aware, we have not used the term. It's ultimately up to respective individuals. There's certainly disagreements among epidemiologists, like there is any discipline. You're going to find people disagree. But in terms of the big picture issue, I don't want us to see the forest beyond the trees. And the bottom line is that there's still too many kids using these products. And so whatever you call it, we've got 2.5 million kids using the products, and we can do better in terms of reducing them. And so I don't want us to get caught up in semantics so much as the big picture. And for me, we've got more work to do. We've made good progress, but we've got to continue to the pedal to the metal while still keeping an open mind around strategies continue to benefit adult smokers to get them to quit completely.
Perfect. And while you were at the CDC in the mid-2010s, many people's first introduction to you came when, along with Dr. Tom Frieden, you started to voice warnings that vaping products could serve as a gateway to combustible cigarette smoking. Today, of course, high school cigarette smoking is at 2%, a figure that no doubt would have inspired great laughs at any tobacco control conference in 2010 if you predicted that's where we'd be at today. Because back then, 1 in 7 high school youth smoked cigarettes. So with the benefit of 7-8 years of hindsight, in your view, is it a fair conclusion that any gateway into smoking over the last decade has likely been outsized numerically by the gateway out of smoking for youth and young adults?
I will say that there's still a strong body of evidence that suggests that the gateway does exist, but it's dependent on a variety of different factors. It's certainly not conclusive evidence, but there's a moderate evidence to demonstrate that. But you also have to look at the net impact of the science. And so I've said publicly many times that you do have some gateway effect. We've seen that through the PATH study and others, but that doesn't mean that every single kid who's using an e-cigarette is going to go on to smoke. There's a variety of factors that impact that. So I caution folks against, definitive statements like that every person is going to transition who use the products. It's certainly happening. But when you look at the net effect, we've definitely seen a decline in overall e-cigarette use. But that doesn't negate the fact that there still may be some kids who are using e-cigarettes that are transitioning to cigarettes. But the net effect at present, we are seeing a decline in use. And as I noted earlier, I hope that continues among kids. It's a good thing, but we can do better.
Yeah, and everything or much of your day is spent looking at the 100-word statute that's known as the appropriate for the protection of public health test for the PMTA reviews. This is a question kind of inspired by thoughts of Dr. David Abrams, formerly of the Truth Initiative, people like David Levy. Does the appropriate for the protection of public health statute require FDA to view teens switching away from cigarettes to vaping as a bad thing?
I think that there's a lot of interpretations of APPH, and I think that we have opportunities to continue to clarify the scope of that. I know there's been a lot of calls in the past. I do hope for opportunities in the future where we can have public engagement on entities to identify perspectives related to the precision around the APPH standard.
So you didn't really necessarily answer the question. Do you think the APPH statute requires FDA to say any teen use of any nicotine product, including a switch from cigarettes to vaping, is a bad thing? Is that required by the statute, or is that a policy-based decision?
The statute requires us to look at the net benefits and risk when we are making a decision on a PMTA, and that includes evaluating the benefits to adult smokers, but also the net risk to kids. And so we are required to look at that relationship. And so in terms of determining the APPH standard, we have to look at the net impact among non-users, and that includes youth, which is a vulnerable population.
Well, I look forward to hopefully having more extensive conversations on how we measure youth use and risks and benefits. Now to move on, documents released as part of a recent lawsuit show that you overruled the Office of Science in order to deny marketing authorizations to Logic's menthol flavored vaping products. Is it common practice at CTP for leadership to overrule the scientific experts within the agency?
Yeah, so I'll say that that is an erroneous description of what occurred. It was not an overrule. We have a formative process at the Center for Tobacco Products where scientists within the Office of Science evaluate specific applications, and they then make determinations based on that science and iterate with Director of the Office of Science, as also the Director of the Center for Tobacco Products. And in this case, there was initial assessment of that science, and then there was further scientific discussion. And I am a scientist by training. I have been for many, many years. And we sat down and discussed the merits of the available science that was presented. And after the discussion of that science and those merits, the determination was made that the applicant did not meet the standard. And that was the result of scientists from both Office of Science and also within the Office of Center Director having that scientific discourse. And that's how science works. You're not going to have universal agreement, but that makes the scientific process thrive, is having those types of discussions. And ultimately, as a result of those, the Office of Science determined by themselves that there was not sufficient science to make the initial recommendation that was made. And so as a result of that discussion, there was a determination to issue a marketing denial order. I wrote the memo that articulated the process that we made, and I was fully aware that it was released via FOIA. So it was no intent to ever withhold anything from anyone. But what I want to make clear is that this was a scientific discussion, and you may have disagreement, but after that productive collegial discussion, the determination was made collectively that there was insufficient science to make that determination. And as far as I'm the center director, we will continue to make decisions based on science, not ideology. And I am hopeful that with the new placement of our incoming Office of Science Director, Matthew Farley, that will continue moving forward.
Great. So the Reagan Udall report, you put out your response today. One thing that may have been addressed in some of the subcategories, there were written remarks of internal FDA CTP whistleblowers, many of whom expressed concern that the agency had become, in their words, driven not by science, but by politics. Furthermore, there were allegations, perhaps relating to the Logic menthol decision, that non-area expert bureaucrats at CTP were interfering and pressuring staff to change science-based decisions. So is there a culture at CTP that leads to this interference with what are supposed to be unbiased application reviews? Have you seen that? I know you've only been there 7 months.
Yeah, I mean, I will reinforce that I'm only here 7 months, and a lot of those discussions, particularly related to the Office of Science, were before I even arrived. And so I certainly respect the perspectives of staff. I welcome the opportunity to hear from them. I've met with several staff across the office, and we were fully aware that this opportunity opened up engagement with not only external stakeholders, but also internal. And for my part, I have an open door policy in this center. And I've heard from many staff on concerns, on things I think are going good, and opportunities where we can make improvements moving forward. And I will say for my part, 7 months in, science is going to rule the day. And we are going to use science to inform our decisions. That will not be ideology. And I am fully committed to constructive dialogue with people. And that includes both internally as well as externally. We may not always agree on everything. And, newsflash, that's how science works. You never have everyone agree on everything, but it's weighing the merits of the scientific argument being made and making sure that that's the best science to answer the specific question at hand. And again, I'm hopeful that with our new leadership in the Office of Science, that we'll be able to accomplish that moving forward.
Well, I was recently at a conference where senior CTP official Todd Cecil was asked why FDA leadership had overruled agency scientists who recommend approving certain vaping products. And he responded quite plainly that if staffers are not aligned with the FDA's posture, then they should look for another job. And that just seems like a rather intolerant way to treat the scientific staff. So what would you say to FDA scientists who feel like they're being overruled for reasons that have nothing to do with science?
Yeah, I can't speak to specific comments in situations where I wasn't present, so I'm not sure if that's adequately or inaccurately characterized. But I will say, as I've noted before, that under my leadership, this center is one of openness and transparency and collegial dialogue. And so I certainly don't want staff leaving because of toxic work environments, or because they feel like they are not heard, or that they are not being permitted to follow the science. And so I've got an open door policy. I've already leveraged it heavily with staff, and I welcome the opportunity to discuss. And if there are concerns, there are mechanisms for staff to verbalize those and make sure that they are heard so that we can resolve them. And I have made it clear to all of my direct reports, including the office directors, that that's how this center will be run. I think that we also have to be cautious too of not allowing a vocal few to represent the entire scope of the staff. And frequently people who are unsatisfied are the most vocal, and you have to make sure you have the full story in terms of certain things that are said and done. But for my part, I'm committed to facilitating a collegial and productive culture in this center moving forward. And we have a strong foundation of that from my predecessors.
Thank you. And one question perhaps that was asked, I didn't get the chance to read every single word of your RUF response. The Reagan Udall Foundation noted back in 2017, Scott Gottlieb, of course, came up with the comprehensive plan. And that envisioned the FDA using regulatory science to bring products on the market to compete with cigarettes, while also making cigarette addiction a thing of the past. Does the comprehensive plan still guide FDA's thinking?
Yeah, so short answer is yes. We've never abandoned the comprehensive plan, and I'm not quite sure how that misperception arose, but maybe in our ongoing formative work to get feedback and transparency from folks, it would help figure that out. But I will say that the plan has never been abandoned. It's been live on our website, and we've continued to follow several of the components of that, including the application reviews, the product standards around menthol, the work around the nicotine standard, as well as enforcement and compliance. One factor that I think is frequently overlooked is that we did have to pulled the foot off the accelerator when we saw the marked increase in youth use of e-cigarettes. Back in 2017 to 2018, we saw nearly 80% increase among youth use of e-cigarettes among high school students. And so that said, we weren't able to hit the accelerator as hard given that environment. That said, I think that with the continued increase in youth use and the reductions in numbers that we've seen, we've got an opportunity to ramp up our efforts related to continuum of risk, which I know is a key component of the nicotine perceptions. I frequently hear from folks on that, particularly lately. So as I noted earlier, for our part, we're continuing to do formative work on messaging for adult smokers. But at no point has this center abandoned the plan. We just had to evolve given the landscape. And now that we're continuing to see declines in youth use, I'm hopeful that we'll continue to be able to proceed forward on all those components. For what it's worth, the new strategic plan that we're developing by the end of this year would ultimately be our new guiding framework in terms of moving forward. The content released today is just a blueprint. Now we've got to implement. Some of the components are going to take longer than others. Some are going to be immediate, including the strategic plan work. We've started working on that already, and we're going to have a public comment period and engagement sometime this summer. So encourage folks to be involved in that. And my long-term hope is making sure that we've got both an internal plan that's very complementary and consistent with the external content so that the public can follow. These are our strategic goals, and these are our long-term outcomes. I think that the nicotine plan did that very well in terms of relaying to the public, this is where we want to go. These are the outcomes and components, and now you can follow moving forward. So we're going to follow a similar paradigm with the strategic plan in place. And again, I encourage folks to participate in the process. We want feedback and want to ensure that it's reflective of all stakeholder input.
Excellent. Allison?
So a lot of my customers, this is just a personal thing that I've noticed, are all ex-smokers, and they are furious because CTP is banned, or they're afraid that they will ban their preferred vaping product through the broken PMTA process. And they want to know, honestly, do you want them to start smoking again? Because that's how it feels to them.
Yeah, so absolutely not. I've noted this several times in the public that there's a net benefit to the individual. If you transition completely, we do not want you to go back to smoking. It's 7,000 chemicals and 70 carcinogens, harming nearly every organ of your body. If you have quit completely, that's a good thing, and congratulations, and keep it up. So we definitely don't want people to go back, but it's important to understand the complexities of the environment that we're working in when it comes to our regulatory authorities. And so Congress has mandated me to do certain things in terms of reviewing applications, enforcement and compliance activities. And so this is not an individual basis vendetta against folks. It's ensuring that we enforce the law. And so from our standpoint, I'm committed to ensuring we ramp up efforts to make sure that we're reviewing those applications in a way that we can authorize those products that meet the bar. But on balance, that doesn't mean that we can be remiss on the enforcement and compliance. And so fully acknowledge people are quitting with e-cigarettes. That's a good thing. But with the parameters that we have specific requirements, and we can certainly make improvements. And I'm committed to making sure we have those efficiencies moving forward, and the best flexibilities to ensure that people are able to get authorized products into their hands to continue use for the purposes of either quitting completely or significantly reducing the amount they're smoking.
And, CTP regulations have bankrupted many vape shop owners. These entrepreneurs are my friends, they're my colleagues, and some of them are watching us right now. Can you explain to them why CTP was justified in destroying their livelihoods when they're just genuinely trying to help people quit smoking?
CTP does not have a policy against small business. Our enforcement and compliance actions have been taken against small and large businesses, and we're committed to enforcing the law. I will say that some of the recent actions in terms of the civil money penalties and also the injunctions were a result of companies that did not obey the law after repeated warnings. And there are many small businesses that are obeying the law and have submitted their applications and have gone through the process. And so it's certainly possible. I will say that for our part, we're committed to continuing to explore opportunities where we can better provide information to applicants to make sure that the process is as flexible and straightforward as possible. I have done several stakeholder meetings since I started, more than 24 with multiple entities, including several e-cigarette advocacy and other groups. And I've heard loud and clear that our application process is onerous. And if we can do better, we should. And I welcome opportunities as a result of the Reagan Udall evaluation for us to lift up the hood and identify ways where we can make this process more flexible and efficient.
So it's possible that in the future, the requirement, seemingly a very strict requirement, that flavored vaping products go through either clinical trials or longitudinal studies, there's room for discussion on that topic.
I will say that we will evaluate each product on the merits of its application. We do not require an RCT. We've been clear in that. But when you look at scientific rigor, there's certain studies that have more strength than others. And ultimately, the Cadillac of science is an RCT or a longitudinal study. If you have other types of studies, that does not necessarily mean they may not be sufficient to pass that bar. But you have to look at the actual study itself and the limitations of that science as well. And so we make the determination based on the application at hand, but there's no, broad scale requirement that you have to submit an RCT. But on balance, scientifically, that's the most robust standard. And if you do have another type of study, you have to make sure that it's sufficiently scientifically rigorous to demonstrate the impact that you intend to show with your application.
Sure. So it's not required, but if you don't include a RCT or a longitudinal study, you're struck on the fatal flaw checklist and denied.
No, that's not correct. You could submit another type of study beyond longitudinal, but it has to be a robust study. And there's ways to do that, but the onus is on the applicant to make sure that they provide sufficient scientific evidence for us to make that determination. And that's a combination of the evidence demonstrating the impact among adults and also that benefit in terms of significantly reducing or quitting completely, but also the risk to youth populations. And so we have to weigh that. The evidence for adults can take multiple factors, but if you're not going to present those Cadillac versions, you have to make sure that what you do submit is robust and not, representative study among a handful of folks that may be your next door neighbors.
Sure. And right on time is time for our Q&A. I believe we have our first person lined up, Jacob Greer, who has written for Salon, Reason, has published his own book with his writings on tobacco. And Jacob, feel free to turn your camera on or join us via audio. We have the fun moment of the webinar where the
Perils of technology.
Jacob, your mic is muted.
There we go. Sorry, I had to join as a panelist to get in here.
Hi, Jacob. How are you?
Well, thank you all for having me on, Dr. King. Thanks for taking the time to be grilled by this tough audience today. We appreciate it. So we've had a lot of questions on the supply side of vaping, which is obviously very, very important. And I think we've covered a lot of that. But I also wanted to follow up and ask about the supply side of combustibles, because back in June, the FDA announced that it was planning to implement some kind of very low nicotine standard for combustible tobacco. It was a little bit vague in the statement about whether this would apply just to cigarettes or what the other products might mean, because we also have mass market cigars, we have pipe tobacco, we have premium cigars. So my question for you is whether you see this low nicotine standard applying across the board to all combustibles, or whether there might be some differentiation in the different product classes.
Yeah, so good question. And I'll say that in typical bureaucratic form, we have processes in the FDA. And so we announce we intend to propose something, we propose it, and then we finalize it. And so right now we're at that first stage. And in our announcement and our intent to propose something, it was focused on cigarettes and certain other combustible products. I will say that as a part of the rulemaking process, we do have a public comment opportunity. And so no decisions have been made at this point. We intend to proceed forward with a proposed rule. And at that point, it will go public, and then we ask for feedback and comment, and that can be from anybody, from scientific researchers all the way to just the general public. And we encourage folks to submit information to tell us what should be included or excluded. But at present, it will be proposed as cigarettes and certain other combustibles based on the announcement that we made earlier this year. But again, the rulemaking process follows a specific standard over time, and that includes incorporating comments from the public. So encourage folks to provide feedback and, importantly, the evidence. Frequently with our campaigns, like with the menthol, we got 250,000 comments, and many of them are just form letters. And I'll tell people that's not helpful to us. If we get 200 people submitting the same thing, it's not quantity over quality. We need the quality in terms of robust evidence to demonstrate the benefits or the risks of what products we would include in terms of any potential product standard around nicotine.
Thank you, Jacob. Next, we will go to Chris Garland, a passionate vapor from Oakland, California.
Passionate. Okay, I like it.
Chris, just unmute.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. How are you, Chris?
I'm very well, and yourself?
Very well, thanks. Good to meet you.
It's nice to meet you too. Thanks for taking time to come out and meet with us. I have a question. As a person of color, a Black man, who used to smoke cigarettes up until about 7 years ago, there has been a ban in our state here in California. I live in the Bay Area in Oakland. The banning of menthol flavored cigarettes. How does the banning of menthol flavored cigarettes that are used by people of color, Black people, Latino, gay, lesbian folks in our area, how does that benefit them, but still leaving regular combustible cigarettes on the shelves for consumption?
So when it comes to the product standards that we implement, we have to look at the net benefits and risks. And when we propose these standards, we look at the available science. And so what that's shown us is that the impact of prohibiting menthol cigarettes would have a profound impact in terms of reducing smoking rates. Our estimates suggest that it would save hundreds of thousands of lives in the long term, which would have a net benefit on population level health. That said, it's also important that we look at potential unintended consequences. And so we continue to do that, but at present, the preponderance of evidence related to the menthol issue is that such a prohibition would be beneficial to public health. There's an important discussion around menthol-related e-cigarettes and whether an individual who's currently using menthol cigarettes would need a menthol e-cigarette to transition completely. I think there's been some misperceptions in the public that FDA has an outright ban on menthol e-cigarettes, which is not correct. We're open to the available evidence. We have denied a few marketing orders related to some in the past, but that doesn't mean that we're not open to evaluating the science moving forward on potential menthol e-cigarettes. So again, it's in looking at the preponderance of the science, making an informed decision based on the evidence, and also continuing to work that we leverage the product standard in a way that those populations do get resources to quit completely and use it as an opportunity rather than a detriment to continue smoking.
Thank you, Chris. And there was a fascinating comment left on the menthol ban docket by Dr. David Levy and Clifford Douglas, formerly of the American Cancer Society, about their analysis of the menthol ban and how menthol e-cigarettes are a big reason why they think a menthol cigarette ban would benefit public health. But that's a question for another time. I want to go to Mark Lis from his vape shop in Michigan. You're on, Mark.
There, I had to unmute myself.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Hello. Thanks for having me today. And thank you, Dr. King, for appearing today and answering our questions. I really appreciate it. So my name's Mark Lis. I've been subjected to U.S. tobacco control for 50 of my 59 years. I smoked for 41 years. I've been smoke-free using flavored open system vapor products now for 9 years. And eventually I bought the vape shop where I successfully quit. And since then, I've helped thousands in my community to successfully quit smoking with those same products, the same products you're now wholesale eliminating. So I have a two-part question. First, as a business owner, I've owned a business that FDA tobacco has forced me to operate in limbo for 7 years. Like every other business owner, I need to make decisions for the future. I have to enter into contractual obligations. I have a responsibility to my clients. Can you tell me in plain language whether or not you are going to approve or authorize any flavored open system vapor products going forward? Or should I abandon my clients, close my doors, and cut my losses now?
Now,
Second,
you want to
go ahead.
No, whatever you prefer. I'm happy to do double question, but whatever.
Okay. Go ahead, if you can answer
In the interest of time, we'll just leave it at part one.
Okay. So first, congratulations on quitting. Like, monumental achievement, and definitely keep it up. I'll say very briefly that the center does not have an outright ban on flavored products, but the onus is on the applicants to submit the evidence to demonstrate that the benefits among adult smokers outweigh the risk to youth. So there is no a de facto policy within this center that would prevent the authorization of a flavored e-cigarette. But I will say that with the continued high rates of youth use, the onus is high to make sure that to demonstrate that a benefit to adult smoker. But it's not impossible. We've seen the authorization of several products already, all tobacco flavored, but we are certainly open to applications on flavored products. And if the science demonstrated that there was a net benefit compared to the risk, we would authorize it. And so that's my take home here is there's no blanket policy against flavored, but we've got to follow the science. And at present, we have not got sufficiently strong evidence that demonstrate that the flavors are needed for the adult smoker to quit. And that's why that comparison with tobacco flavored and other flavors is really critical in the applications. And that was outlined in previous guidance we've given, and it continues to be the case for all flavors, including menthol.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Next, we will go to Skip Murray. And while we get her up on the screen, I will congratulate Skip. Skip is a big person about changing the way we talk about smokers. Instead of saying former smokers, people who used to smoke, or people who smoke. And Tobacco Control, thanks in part to her just constant haranguing on this point, recently published an editorial that they will actually be using people-focused language when talking about people who smoke.
Nice. I like person first. Great. Good to meet you, Skip.
Nice to meet you too, Dr. King. I'm honored to have the opportunity to ask you a question. And I did hear you talk about language last week in your health equity presentation.
Okay.
And I was glad to hear it. And I hope the FDA continues with that mission. You've mentioned several times that it's the FDA's job to enforce the law. Do you ever wish the wording of the law included recognition of reduced risk products and perhaps a pathway to the market similar to what they do in the UK? What do you think could be done to improve the PMTA process?
Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of things that I would wish, but I unfortunately was not involved in writing the Tobacco Control Act, and I'll leave that to Congress. But I will say, for what it's worth, definitely opportunity for improvement. And I think that we're at a really important time in the history of this center where we've got new leadership and new ideas. I think we've had a strong foundation in the past, but we've got an opportunity with me coming on to reevaluate how we've done things. And so I'm hopeful that with the Reagan Udall evaluation response we released today, that there's a lot more opportunities to engage with stakeholders, to engage with the public, to really get that feedback around what we can do better, and then importantly, start to implement them. And so I see this as kind of the beginning of that. We've still got a long road ahead of us in terms of implementation, but I strongly encourage everyone, including yourself. It sounds like you've been quite prolific in moving people forward, so we can use your chutzpah around person first and other things, but really using this as an opportunity to get the feedback to make change. So definitely opportunity for improvement, including around the application review process, as well as our communication and transparency, and look forward with working with folks moving forward.
And let's go, before we will hopefully wrap with a question from our friend Nick Green. But before that, we have one more person on camera, Victoria Vasconcelos, who I may have butchered her name, but she is a great person from Illinois, very focused in her vape shop operations. Vicky, are you there?
Am I there?
Yes, you are. Hi, Victoria. How are you?
Very well. Thank you, Dr. King, for taking my question.
Hi.
The LGBTQ population is one that I serve and one that has an unfortunately high smoking rate. Does it make you cringe to see groups serving this community putting out boilerplate anti-nicotine messaging that infers that all vaping by adults is a public health hazard? And are there plans to deliver targeted, adult-oriented, realistic messages regarding the relative harms of vaping versus smoking?
Yeah, so I will say that certainly admire the work you've done with the LGBTQ plus population. Certainly a priority of mine, as I've said previously, around health equity. And on the second point, answer is yes. We're continuing to work on formative research to look at the best messaging that's scientifically defensible, but also is going to register with the population around continuum of risk and also nuances around misperceptions of nicotine. But in the interim, I think we've also got immediate opportunities. When I came to FDA, I noticed that our web content in particular is incredibly dense, and you shouldn't need multiple abbreviations after your name to understand very simple things. So I think we've got opportunity on multiple fronts, longer term to get the science around the most effective messaging, but in the near term, maybe saying things a little more succinctly. They can still be defensible, but not necessarily a scientific diatribe on the web. So well taken comment and agree with you.
Sure. And our final, thank you, Victoria. Our final question comes from Nick Green, who cannot get on his microphone because he is live streaming this event to his YouTube audience. His question is, when you look at adult usage today and the effect on population level health, is there a level of youth usage that we could achieve where what we're seeing with adults would in your mind, outweigh the risks to youth? Is there a level of past 30-day use that you are targeting other than zero?
Yeah, so I think it's important to make a distinction between individual and population level. And so I think the expectation that we're going to get to zero, we've never seen that with anything. So that's unrealistic, but we have to look at the merits of the individual applications that are submitted. And so in terms of FDA's responsibility, we have to look at the net risks and benefits, and that's what we'll continue to do. And it's ultimately going to depend on the evidence in that application. And so as we continue to see that decline among youth, which is a good thing, the bar is going to get lower in terms of documenting the net benefit among adults, but ultimately it's going to depend on that science. And so I can't reinforce enough the importance of folks ensuring that they have robust as possible the application so that we've got the evidence we can use to inform a marketing decision. And so it's not so much individual numbers that make a broad scale decision, it's looking at the individual merits. And in the context of the current environment where we're seeing declines among kids, that's a standard where you may not need as much evidence among the benefit among adults, but you still got to demonstrate it, and that's where the science is going to come in.
Sure. Allison?
Yep. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Dr. King, we have received so many great questions that we did not get to. So if we sent you some of the most pressing questions, would you consider providing written responses?
I can't commit to, because I don't know how many there are, and our team has finite resources, but I will say we're certainly happy to consider and also other opportunities for engagement. I really appreciate the opportunity, the invitation. As I've said publicly before, I have not turned down a single meeting. I enjoy talking with people across all our stakeholder groups, and I hope that this is the beginning of future engagement. And I always encourage folks, if you've got something on your mind, submit it to FDA. We've got formal channels where you can submit comments, and we're happy to do so. And if you have any questions, it's our job to make sure that we engage with stakeholders in the public, and I'm committed to making sure we continue that under my leadership.
And as we promised, as we promised, it is 2 p.m. We're going to wrap up and let you get to your next 15-minute increment meeting. Thank you to Dr. King for joining us. Thank you to the FDA Comms Department for setting this up. And thank you to all of our manufacturer and retail members, as well as the harm reduction advocates, researchers, and FDA employees tuning in at home and at the office. Thank you, Dr. King.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Alli. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Have a good one.
Thank you again to everyone joining us. We'll have more to say once we get the chance to digest it all. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, guys.